The plague swept through the Roman legions like wildfire in the winter of 168 AD. Bodies piled high in the military camps along the Danube frontier, and the stench of death hung heavy in the frozen air. In his command tent, surrounded by maps of barbarian territories and dispatches from a crumbling empire, sat a man who would rather be anywhere else. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, philosopher, and reluctant warrior, dipped his pen into ink and continued writing in his personal journal by candlelight. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way, he wrote, his fingers stiff from the cold. This was not the life Marcus had envisioned for himself. Born on April 26, 121 AD, as Marcus Annius Verus, he had grown up in a wealthy Roman family with no expectation of ever wearing the purple. His childhood in the hills outside Rome was spent among books and tutors, learning Greek philosophy and Roman law. Young Marcus showed such intellectual promise that Emperor Hadrian nicknamed him Brissimus, most truthful one. While other Roman boys his age dreamed of military glory and conquest, Marcus lost himself in the works of Epictetus and the Stoic philosophers, finding in their teachings a framework for living that would sustain him through trials he could never have imagined. The trajectory of his life changed forever when Emperor Hadrian, on his deathbed, orchestrated a complex succession plan. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius as his heir on the condition that Antoninus would in turn adopt young Marcus. At 17, Marcus found himself heir to the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The weight of this destiny pressed upon him like a physical burden. He wrote later that he wept when he learned of his adoption, knowing that his dreams of a quiet life devoted to philosophy were forever shattered. For 23 years, Marcus served as Caesar under Antoninus Pius, learning the intricate machinery of imperial administration. Antoninus was a gentle and effective ruler, and his reign was marked by such peace and prosperity that historians would later call it the height of the Pax Romana. Marcus spent these years in preparation, studying law, attending Senate meetings, and sitting beside Antoninus as he dispensed justice. He married Faustina the Younger, Antoninus's daughter, in 145 AD, and though their marriage was arranged for political reasons, genuine affection grew between them. Together they would have 13 children, though the brutal infant mortality rates of ancient Rome would claim many of them, a source of deep personal anguish that Marcus would process through his philosophical writings. When Antoninus died in 161 AD, Marcus became emperor at age 39. His first act revealed his character. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, rule as co-emperor with him. Never before had Rome been ruled by two emperors with equal power. It was an unprecedented act of humility and wisdom, recognizing that the empire had grown too vast for one man to govern effectively. While Marcus handled the administration of the empire from Rome, Lucius took command of the legions in the east, where the Parthian Empire threatened Roman interests. But the golden age of Antoninus was ending. In 165 AD, victorious Roman legions returning from Parthia brought with them something far deadlier than any barbarian army plague. Modern historians believe it was probably smallpox, though some argue for measles. Whatever the disease, it devastated the empire. Contemporary accounts describe victims suffering from fever, throat inflammation, diarrhea, and skin eruptions. The physician Galen, who witnessed the plague firsthand, wrote that victims often died within 2 weeks of showing symptoms. At its height, the plague killed 2,000 people per day in Rome alone. Bodies were thrown into the Tiber River when burial grounds overflowed. The Antonini Plague, as history would name it, killed between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman Empire, perhaps a quarter of the population in affected areas. The economic and social fabric of the empire began to unravel. Farms lay abandoned as agricultural workers died or fled. Trade routes collapsed. The army, packed into close quarters in military camps, was particularly devastated. Some historians estimate that a quarter to a third of the Roman military died from the plague. As if the plague weren't enough, the Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier sensed weakness. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and other tribes that had long been held in check by Roman power now swept across the frontier. For the first time in centuries, barbarian armies threatened Italy itself. In 167 AD, they crossed the Alps and besieged Aquileia, sending panic through the Italian peninsula. Rome had not faced such an existential threat since Hannibal crossed the Alps 4 centuries earlier. Marcus, the philosopher who had wanted nothing more than a life of quiet contemplation, now found himself leading armies into battle. He sold imperial treasures, including art from the palace, to fund the war effort when plague-depleted tax revenues proved insufficient. He recruited gladiators, slaves, and bandits into the legions to replace the plague dead. And most remarkably, he left the comfort of Rome to personally lead the campaigns along the Danube frontier, spending most of the last decade of his life in military camps. It was during these campaigns, in the quiet hours between battles, that Marcus wrote the work that would immortalize him, his Meditations. Never intended for publication, these were his private reflections, his attempts to process the horrors he witnessed daily through the lens of Stoic philosophy. Be like the rocky headland on which the waves constantly break, he wrote one night. It stands firm, and round it the seething waters are laid to rest. The conditions in the military camps were harsh beyond modern comprehension. Winter temperatures along the Danube regularly dropped below freezing. The soldiers lived in leather tents that provided little protection from the elements. Food was often scarce, limited to hard bread, porridge, and whatever could be foraged or requisitioned from local populations. The plague continued to ravage the camps, and Marcus himself likely contracted the disease at some point, though he survived. His beloved co-emperor and adoptive brother Lucius Verus was not so fortunate, dying of the plague in 169 AD, leaving Marcus to rule alone. The barbarian wars dragged on year after year. Marcus would win victories, negotiate treaties, and establish new defensive lines, only to have new tribes attack or old enemies break their agreements. The Marcomanni were subdued, but then the Quadi rose. The Sarmatians raided across the frozen Danube. The Costoboci swept through the Balkans and into Greece, destroying the ancient sanctuary at Eleusis. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and two more appeared. Through it all, Marcus maintained his philosophical discipline. He woke before dawn each day despite his preference for sleeping late, because duty demanded it. He spent hours hearing legal cases, even in the field, ensuring that Roman justice continued despite the chaos. He corresponded with provincial governors, managing food supplies for plague-stricken cities, authorizing emergency measures, trying to hold together an empire that seemed determined to fly apart. His personal tragedies mounted alongside the public catastrophes. His wife Faustina died in 175 AD while accompanying him on campaign. Despite rumors of her infidelity that historians still debate, Marcus's grief was profound and genuine. He had the Senate deify her and founded a charity for orphan girls in her name. Of his 13 children, only 5 survived to adulthood, and he was forced to watch his son Commodus grow into a man very different from himself, athletic where Marcus was bookish, cruel where Marcus was compassionate, interested in gladiatorial games rather than philosophy. Yet Marcus never gave in to despair. His stoicism was not the emotionless stereotype often associated with the word, but rather a profound engagement with the difficulty of life coupled with an unshakable commitment to duty and virtue. The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it, he reminded himself. He found moments of beauty even in the harsh military camps. The loyalty of his soldiers, the changing seasons along the Danube, the simple pleasure of a warm fire after a cold march. The military situation gradually improved through Marcus's persistent efforts. He developed new tactics for fighting the mobile barbarian forces, incorporating auxiliary units of barbarian allies into the Roman military structure. He established a new defensive system along the Danube, with fortified camps and early warning systems. He even began an ambitious plan to create two new Roman provinces north of the Danube, which would have pushed Roman power deep into barbarian territory and perhaps changed the course of European history. But time was running out for the philosopher emperor. Years of campaigning in harsh conditions, exposure to plague, and the tremendous stress of managing a crisis-ridden empire had broken his health. By early 180 AD, Marcus knew he was dying. He was at Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly Sirmium, still on campaign, still fighting to protect Rome. According to the historian Dio Cassius, when it became clear that death was near, Marcus refused food and drink to hasten his end. His last days were spent ensuring a smooth transition of power to Commodus, despite his deep reservations about his son's character. Some historians have criticized this decision as Marcus's greatest failure, but he had little choice. Commodus was his only surviving son, and passing over him would likely have triggered a civil war that the plague-weakened empire could not survive. Marcus spent his final hours giving Commodus advice on governing, advice that would largely be ignored. On March 17, 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died. His last words, according to his biographer, were to the tribune of the night watch who asked for the password, "Go to the rising sun, for I am setting." He was 58 years old, and had ruled for 19 years, almost all of them in crisis. Marcus's death marked the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of Rome's long decline. Commodus would indeed prove to be a disaster as emperor, more interested in performing as a gladiator than governing. The empire would never again reach the heights it had known under the 5 good emperors. Yet Marcus's true legacy was not political but philosophical. His meditations, eventually published and translated into dozens of languages, would inspire countless readers through the centuries. From medieval theologians to modern presidents, people have found in Marcus's words a guide for living with dignity, duty, and wisdom in difficult times. What makes Marcus Aurelius extraordinary is not that he was a philosopher who became an emperor, but that he remained a philosopher while being an emperor. In an age when absolute power corrupted absolutely, Marcus retained his humanity, his compassion, and his commitment to justice. He could have retreated to his palace, sent others to fight his wars, indulged in the unlimited pleasures available to a Roman emperor. Instead, he spent his last decade in freezing military camps, fighting to protect an empire and a civilization he believed worth preserving. His example resonates across the centuries because the challenges he faced, though different in detail, are universal in nature. How to maintain integrity under pressure, how to face loss and disappointment without becoming bitter, how to do one's duty even when it conflicts with personal desires. Marcus showed that philosophy is not an abstract intellectual exercise, but a practical tool for living. His stoicism was tested in the crucible of real crisis and emerged validated. The man who had wanted nothing more than to be a philosopher became one of history's most important philosophers precisely because he was forced to be something else. Every word of his meditations carries the weight of lived experience. When he writes about facing death, he had seen thousands die of plague. When he discusses dealing with difficult people, he had negotiated with barbarian chieftains and managed a treacherous senate. When he explores loss, he had buried his wife and most of his children. Marcus Aurelius remains a towering figure not because he was perfect. He made mistakes, showed occasional harshness to Christians, and perhaps stayed too long in Germania when Rome needed governing, but because he represents the best of what human beings can aspire to. Wisdom coupled with action, power tempered by restraint, and duty fulfilled despite personal cost. In our modern age, faced with our own plagues and wars and moral challenges, the philosopher emperor's words still echo with truth. What we do now echoes in eternity. The castle of Poitiers erupted in celebration on Easter Day, 1137. 15-year-old Eleanor, now Duchess of Aquitaine and the wealthiest woman in Europe, stood in the great hall surrounded by troubadours singing of her beauty, knights pledging their swords to her service, and courtiers calculating how to win her favor. Just days before, her father Duke William X had died on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, leaving Eleanor to inherit the vast duchy of Aquitaine, nearly a third of what would become modern France. She was young, beautiful, intelligent, and now controlled more land than the King of France himself. The world lay before her like a chessboard, and Eleanor would prove to be a master of the game. Born around 1122 in the Palace of Poitiers, Eleanor grew up in the most sophisticated court in Europe, while northern France and England still embraced the harsh austerity of military culture. Aquitaine flourished with art, music, and poetry. Her grandfather, Duke William IX, had been the first known troubadour, composing bawdy and romantic verses that scandalized the church and delighted the court. Eleanor inherited not just his lands but his love of culture, his irreverent spirit, and his political cunning. Her education was extraordinary for a woman of her time. She learned to read and write in Latin and her native tongue, the langue d'oc of southern France. She studied arithmetic, music, history, and literature. Unlike most noble women who were kept secluded, Eleanor rode horses, hunted with falcons, and participated fully in court life. Her father, lacking sons, had raised her to rule. She learned to preside over legal proceedings, manage estates, and navigate the complex web of feudal obligations that held medieval society together. The moment her father's death became known, King Louis VI of France moved with lightning speed. Aquitaine was too rich and strategic to remain independent. On his deathbed, Duke William had placed Eleanor under the protection of the French king, probably hoping to preserve his daughter's inheritance. Louis VI had other plans. He immediately arranged for Eleanor to marry his son and heir, Prince Louis. The marriage would bind Aquitaine to the French crown, making France the dominant power in Western Europe. The wedding took place on July 25, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. Eleanor wore a gown of scarlet silk embroidered with golden lions, her auburn hair flowing free in the style of unmarried maidens for the last time. Prince Louis, pale and aesthetic, looked more like a monk than a warrior, which indeed matched his temperament. Within weeks of the wedding, Louis VI died, and the teenage couple found themselves king and queen of France. The early years of the marriage were a disaster waiting to happen. Louis VII was pious to the point of obsession, spending hours in prayer, wearing hair shirts, and fasting until he made himself ill. Eleanor, raised in the sensual, sophisticated court of Aquitaine, found the Parisian court insufferably dull. She shocked the conservative northern French nobility by introducing Aquitanian fashions, form-fitting gowns, elaborate headdresses, and cosmetics. She brought her troubadours north, filling the austere palace with music and poetry about courtly love. The clash of cultures was profound. Eleanor expected to rule alongside her husband, as she had been trained to do. She attended royal councils, offered political advice, and maintained her own court within the court. The French nobility, especially Louis's mother Adelaide, and the powerful minister Abbot Suger, were appalled. They whispered that Eleanor was too worldly, too independent, possibly even unfaithful. The queen's patronage of troubadours, with their songs celebrating adultery and passion, only fueled the gossip. Despite their differences, Eleanor initially held considerable influence over Louis. When her younger sister Petronilla fell in love with the married Count Raoul of Vermandois, Eleanor persuaded Louis to support the scandalous match. When the Pope excommunicated Raoul and placed his lands under interdict, Eleanor convinced Louis to go to war against the Pope's supporter, Count Theobald of Champagne. The war was a disaster. Louis's forces burned the town of Vitry, and 1,300 civilians who had taken refuge in a church died when the building caught fire. Louis never recovered from the guilt, and his relationship with Eleanor grew increasingly strained. To atone for Vitry, Louis decided to join the Second Crusade in 1147. Eleanor shocked everyone by announcing she would accompany him, bringing 300 ladies of Aquitaine and thousands of her own vassals. She appeared at the assembly in Vézelay dressed as an Amazon warrior, riding a white horse, surrounded by her ladies similarly attired. It was pure theater, but it worked. Recruitment for the crusade soared. The crusade was a catastrophe militarily, but a turning point in Eleanor's life. The journey to the Holy Land took them through Constantinople, where Eleanor experienced a sophisticated Byzantine court, far more magnificent than anything in Western Europe. She saw mosaics that seemed to capture light itself, tasted food spiced with cinnamon and pepper, or silks so fine they seemed like water. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, young, handsome, and cultured, paid her elaborate court, recognizing a kindred spirit in the intelligent French queen. The Crusader army reached Antioch in March 1148, where Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, ruled as prince. Raymond was everything Louis was not: tall, golden-haired, charming, a skilled warrior and politician. He was only 8 years older than Eleanor, and had been raised in the English court before claiming Antioch. The reunion between niece and uncle was warm, too warm for Louis's comfort. Eleanor spent hours in private conference with Raymond, who argued persuasively that the Crusaders should attack Aleppo to secure Antioch's borders. It was sound strategy, but Louis suspected the meetings were about more than military planning. The crisis came when Louis announced the army would march directly to Jerusalem, ignoring Raymond's strategic advice. Eleanor exploded in rage, declaring she wanted an annulment of their marriage on grounds of consanguinity. They were fourth cousins, too closely related by church law. She would remain in Antioch, she announced, with her Aquitanian vassals. Louis's response revealed the depths to which their relationship had sunk. He had Eleanor forcibly dragged from Antioch in the middle of the night and compelled to continue to Jerusalem. The breach was irreparable. The crusade failed miserably, with the Crusader army destroyed attempting to take Damascus. On the voyage home, Eleanor and Louis traveled on separate ships. When they stopped in Rome, Pope Eugenius III attempted to reconcile them, even preparing their bedchamber himself and blessing their bed. Eleanor dutifully produced a second daughter, but both knew the marriage was over. They maintained a facade for 3 more years, but in March 1152, the church council at Beaugency annulled their marriage. Eleanor retained Aquitaine, as the marriage contract stipulated, once again making her the greatest matrimonial prize in Europe. What happened next stunned Christian Europe. Within 8 weeks of her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, and soon to be King of England. The marriage took place on May 18, 1152, without the French king's permission, a technical requirement that Eleanor simply ignored. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor, but their attraction was immediate and intense. Where Louis had been weak and pious, Henry was forceful and pragmatic. He was described by contemporaries as having a lion's face, gray eyes that could turn black with rage, and an energy that seemed inexhaustible. He spoke multiple languages, never sat still, and possessed a brilliant political mind. The marriage was a geopolitical earthquake. Henry already controlled Normandy and Anjou. With Eleanor's Aquitaine added to his domains, he controlled more of France than the French king. When Henry inherited the English throne in 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England, presiding over an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Together, they were the power couple of the medieval world. The early years of their marriage were passionate and productive. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children in 13 years, including 5 sons. She proved an able administrator, governing England efficiently during Henry's frequent absences. She established courts of love where troubadours sang and questions of romance were debated. She patronized artists, poets, and writers, helping to create the literary tradition of courtly love that would influence European culture for centuries. The legend of King Arthur and his knights, with its emphasis on chivalry and romantic love, flourished under her patronage. But Henry proved no easier a husband than Louis. His infidelities were flagrant and numerous, including a long-term relationship with Rosamund Clifford that he barely attempted to hide. His temper was volcanic. He once rolled on the floor in rage, chewing rushes like a madman. Most seriously, he refused to share real power with Eleanor, expecting her to be a traditional queen despite her vast personal holdings and political experience. The breaking point came over their sons. Eleanor had raised them to be proud, independent rulers, while Henry wanted to maintain absolute control. As the boys grew older, tensions exploded. Young Henry, the heir, was crowned co-king but given no real authority. Richard, Eleanor's favorite, was made Duke of Aquitaine but under his mother's guidance, not his father's. Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany through marriage. John, the youngest, was called Lackland because there were no territories left for him. In 1173, Eleanor made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She backed her sons in rebellion against their father. It was an unprecedented act, a queen supporting her children against the king. The revolt had been brewing for months. Young Henry had fled to the court of Louis VII, Eleanor's ex-husband, in one of history's great ironies, and Richard and Geoffrey soon joined him. Eleanor attempted to escape Aquitaine dressed as a man to join her sons, but Henry's men captured her near Chartres. The rebellion failed, and Henry showed his ruthless side. While he eventually reconciled with his sons, they were his heirs. After all, Eleanor paid the full price for her betrayal. She was imprisoned, moved between various English castles for the next 16 years. It was comfortable imprisonment. She had servants, books, and luxuries. But it was imprisonment nonetheless. The woman who had been the freest spirit of her age was caged. During her imprisonment, Eleanor watched from afar as her family tore itself apart. Young Henry died of dysentery in 1183 while rebelling again against his father. Geoffrey died in a tournament in 1186. Henry took a new mistress, Alice of France, who was betrothed to Richard, and who was also Eleanor's former daughter-in-law from her French marriage. The Plantagenet family dysfunction reached epic proportions. Everything changed on July 6, 1189, when Henry II died, worn out by another rebellion, this time by Richard in alliance with Philip Augustus of France. Richard, now King Richard I, later known as the Lionheart, immediately freed his mother. At 67, an age when most medieval nobles were long dead, Eleanor emerged from imprisonment with her energy and political skills intact. She would have one more act in her extraordinary life. Richard needed Eleanor desperately. He was a warrior, not an administrator, and he trusted no one else to govern his empire while he went on the Third Crusade. Eleanor, finally given the power she had always craved, proved brilliant. She traveled thousands of miles, despite her age, securing Richard's realm. She arranged his marriage to Berengaria of Navarre, journeying to Spain to collect the bride. When Richard was captured returning from crusade and held for ransom by the German emperor, Eleanor personally negotiated his release and helped raise the enormous ransom of 150,000 marks, literally a king's ransom. Her final great act came after Richard's death in 1199. John, the last of her sons, was a weak king facing a strong challenge from her grandson Arthur of Brittany. At 77, Eleanor took the field herself, defending Anjou and Aquitaine for John. When Arthur besieged her at Mirabeau Castle in 1202, the 80-year-old queen held out until John arrived with a relief force. It was her last military action. Eleanor retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had long been a patron. But even in retirement, she remained politically active, working to arrange marriages for her granddaughters that would secure peace between England and France. She lived to see her daughter Joanna die in childbirth. Another son, John, proved himself perhaps the worst king England ever had. and her beloved Aquitaine ravaged by war. Yet she never lost her wit or her will. Eleanor of Aquitaine died on April 1, 1204, at the remarkable age of 82. She had outlived all but 2 of her 10 children, had been queen of both France and England, had gone on crusade, had rebelled against 2 husbands, had been imprisoned for 16 years, and had emerged to rule an empire. She was buried at Fontevraud beside Henry II, the husband she had loved, hated, and fought. Her effigy shows her reading a book, a fitting tribute to a woman whose intelligence and education had been her greatest weapons. Eleanor's legacy extends far beyond her political achievements. She fundamentally changed the culture of medieval Europe. The concept of courtly love, where knights performed great deeds for noble ladies who inspired them from afar, flourished under her patronage. This tradition would influence Western literature from the Arthurian romances to Shakespeare to modern fantasy novels. She showed that women could rule as effectively as men, managing complex political situations with skill and determination. Her court became a model for royal courts across Europe, blending sophistication with power. But perhaps Eleanor's greatest achievement was simply surviving and thriving in a world designed to constrain her. Every convention of her time said that women should be passive, obedient, and subordinate. Eleanor was none of these things. She insisted on her right to power based on her inheritance, her intelligence, and her will. When thwarted, she fought back. When imprisoned, she endured. When freed, she seized power and wielded it effectively. The woman who had ridden to the Second Crusade dressed as an Amazon warrior died as she had lived, on her own terms, unbroken and unbowed. In an age when women's names were rarely recorded by history, Eleanor of Aquitaine made herself unforgettable. She played the Game of Thrones in an age when the stakes were life and death, and through sheer force of personality, intelligence, and determination, she won. The Thames Tunnel was flooding again. Water burst through the protective shield with a roar that could be heard above ground, sending workers scrambling for their lives through the narrow, gaslit passages. 20-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel was the last to leave, as always, making sure every man escaped before him. As he struggled through the rising waters on January 12, 1828, a massive wave knocked him unconscious. He would have drowned in that dark tunnel beneath London's river if not for a worker who dragged his limp body to safety. Brunel woke up days later, his body broken, 6 men dead in the flood, the tunnel project that had consumed his youth seemingly doomed. Most men would have quit engineering forever after such trauma. Brunel spent his recovery time designing ships. Born on April 9, 1806 in Portsmouth, Isambard Kingdom Brunel entered a world on the cusp of transformation. His father, Marc Brunel, was a French engineer who had fled the revolution and made his fortune in Britain designing machines for mass-producing ship's blocks for the Royal Navy. His mother, Sophia Kingdom, was English, and young Isambard grew up bilingual and bicultural, as comfortable in a Parisian salon as an English workshop. From his earliest memories, his playground was his father's drawing office, where he built elaborate models and absorbed engineering principles before he could properly write. The boy showed genius from the start, but it was a restless, ambitious genius that would never be satisfied with ordinary achievement. At 8, he was already drawing detailed architectural plans. At 14, his father sent him to France to study at the Lycée Henry IV and the University of Caen, where he excelled in mathematics and drawing. But it was his apprenticeship with Abraham Louis Breguet, the master clockmaker, that truly shaped him. From Breguet, young Brunel learned that engineering was not just about function, but about elegance, precision, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. When Brunel returned to England in 1822, the Industrial Revolution was accelerating. Steam engines were transforming manufacturing, but transportation remained locked in the age of horse and sail. Roads were terrible, canals were slow and limited, and the few experimental railways used horses or stationary engines to pull carriages. Mark Brunel had begun work on something unprecedented, a tunnel under the Thames, the first underwater tunnel in the world. Isambard, barely 17, became his father's chief assistant. The Thames Tunnel was a nightmare made real. The river above was essentially an open sewer, receiving all of London's waste. The ground they tunneled through was saturated with this foul water, which constantly seeped through their protective shield. Workers died from disease, drowning, and gas explosions. The tunnel flooded 5 times during construction. Young Brunel worked 18-hour days, often standing waist-deep in sewage-contaminated water, personally examining every inch of the tunnel face for weaknesses. The 1828 flood that nearly killed Brunel shut down the project for 7 years. During his long recovery, bedridden and in constant pain, Brunel's mind refused to rest. He designed bridges that seemed to defy gravity, sketched plans for hospitals that would revolutionize patient care, and imagined ships powered by steam that could cross oceans. When he finally recovered, he was ready to reshape the world. His first independent triumph came in 1831 when, at just 24, he won the competition to design a bridge across the Avon Gorge at Clifton. His design was audacious, a suspension bridge with a span of 700 feet, longer than any existing bridge in the world. The judge, Thomas Telford, Britain's most celebrated engineer, initially rejected all designs including Brunel's, saying such a span was impossible. When forced to choose, he still doubted the young man's radical design would work. Brunel would spend the rest of his life fighting to see it built, though he would die before its completion. But it was the Great Western Railway that made Brunel a household name and changed Britain forever. In 1833, before any major railway existed, a group of Bristol merchants hired Brunel to survey a railway route from London to Bristol. Brunel didn't just survey a route, he reimagined what a railway could be. While other engineers built railways that followed the contours of the land with steep gradients and sharp curves, Brunel insisted on what he called the flying level, a route so flat and straight that trains could maintain unprecedented speeds. To achieve this vision required engineering on a scale never before attempted. The Box Tunnel, at 1.83 miles long, was the longest railway tunnel in the world when completed. Workers, many of the navvies, from Ireland escaping the poverty of their homeland, worked by candlelight in conditions that killed 1 man per week during construction. Brunel personally supervised the work, often descending into the tunnel at night to check progress. Legend says he aligned the tunnel so that on his birthday, April 9th, the rising sun would shine straight through it, though this may be Victorian mythmaking. Brunel's vision for the Great Western Railway extended beyond mere tracks. He designed every aspect of the system, from the stations to the signals to the trains themselves. His terminus at Paddington Station in London, completed in 1854, was a cathedral of iron and glass, its soaring arches and natural light creating a space that made travel feel like an adventure rather than an ordeal. His bridge at Maidenhead, with the flattest brick arches ever built, was so radical that critics predicted it would collapse the moment scaffolding was removed. It still carries trains today, 180 years later. But Brunel's true obsession was speed. His broad-gauge track, at 7 feet 0.25 inches, was nearly 3 feet wider than the standard gauge used by other railways. This allowed for larger, more stable, faster trains. His locomotives, with names like Firefly and North Star, could reach speeds of 60 miles per hour when most people had never traveled faster than a galloping horse. The journey from London to Bristol, which took 2 days by coach, was reduced to 4 hours. The railway was just the beginning of Brunel's grand vision. In 1835, at a directors' meeting of the Great Western Railway, someone complained that the railway was too long. Brunel replied, "Why not make it longer? Build a steamship to go from Bristol to New York, and call it the Great Western. What started as a joke became an obsession. Critics said a steamship could never carry enough coal to cross the Atlantic. Brunel proved mathematically that while a ship's coal requirements increased with the square of its dimensions, its capacity increased with the cube. Therefore, a big enough ship could carry sufficient coal and cargo. The Great Western, launched in 1838, was the largest steamship in the world at 236 feet long. On her maiden voyage to New York, she arrived with coal to spare, proving the critics wrong and establishing the first regular transatlantic steamship service. But for Brunel, she was just a prototype. His next ship, the Great Britain 1843, revolutionized shipbuilding. She was the first large ship built of iron, the first to be driven by a screw propeller rather than paddle wheels, and at 322 feet, the largest ship afloat. When she ran aground in Ireland in 1846, critics said iron ships were too vulnerable. Brunel's salvage operation, using hydraulic jacks and careful planning, saved her and proved iron ships were actually more resilient than wooden ones. Yet even the Great Britain was not enough for Brunel's ambition. He envisioned a ship that could travel to Australia without refueling, opening up the furthest reaches of the empire to regular communication. The Great Eastern, begun in 1854, was engineering madness on an unprecedented scale. At 692 feet long and 18,915 tons, she was 6 times larger than any ship ever built. She had both paddle wheels and a screw propeller, powered by engines that generated 8,000 horsepower. Her double hull, an innovation that wouldn't become standard for another 50 years, made her virtually unsinkable. Building the Great Eastern nearly killed Brunel. The ship was too large for any existing shipyard, so she had to be built on the Thames riverbank and launched sideways. The contractor, John Scott Russell, proved incompetent and possibly corrupt, nearly bankrupting the project multiple times. Brunel had to take over direct control, managing thousands of workers, millions of rivets, and iron plates that had to be forged, shaped, and fitted with precision. He developed new techniques for everything from riveting to launching, inventing solutions to problems that had never existed before. The launch itself became a public spectacle and private nightmare. On November 3, 1857, thousands gathered to watch the great ship enter the Thames. Brunel had wanted a controlled, slow launch using hydraulic rams, but the directors insisted on a public event. The ship moved a few feet and stuck. It took 3 months of agonizing effort, with Brunel working around the clock in freezing winter conditions, to finally get the Great Eastern into the water. The stress was visible on his face. Photographs from the period show a man aging years and months. While building ships that defied imagination, Brunel continued his railway work. The Great Western Railway had been such a success that he was commissioned to design railways across Britain and Ireland. The South Devon Railway featured his atmospheric railway system, an innovative but ultimately failed experiment where trains were pulled by pneumatic pressure through a tube. When it failed, Brunel took responsibility and paid for conversions out of his own pocket, nearly bankrupting himself. His Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash, completed in 1859, was his masterpiece of railway engineering. Spanning the Tamar River between Devon and Cornwall, its unique lenticular truss design created a structure both beautiful and revolutionary. Brunel, by then dying, insisted on being taken across it lying on a specially designed couch before it opened. It was his last journey. Throughout his career, Brunel maintained a punishing schedule that would destroy most men. He typically slept 4 hours a night, often in his office or on site. He smoked 40 cigars a day, fueling himself with coffee and determination. His notebook, which he carried everywhere, contains over 5,000 pages of calculations, sketches, and ideas, many scrawled while traveling in carriages or standing in half-built tunnels. He personally supervised every major project, believing that an engineer must understand every bolt, rivet, and stress point. His attention to detail was legendary and sometimes maddening. For the Great Western Railway, he designed special fireproof safes for important documents, lamp posts that wouldn't vibrate when trains passed, and even the company's official seal. He insisted on testing every bridge personally, often standing underneath while the heaviest available load crossed above. When contractors cut corners, he would arrive unannounced at 3 a.m. to inspect work, his small figure and its trademark tall hat emerging from the darkness like an apparition. But Brunel was more than just a workaholic genius. He had a showman's flair for the dramatic. At the opening of the Great Western Railway, he drove the first locomotive himself at unprecedented speed, terrifying the directors. He once descended in a diving bell he had designed to inspect underwater foundations, nearly dying when the bell became stuck. During a magic trick for his children, he accidentally swallowed a half-sovereign coin that lodged in his windpipe. He designed and built a special centrifuge to spin himself upside down until the coin fell out. His personal life, squeezed between his engineering obsessions, was surprisingly happy. In 1836, he married Mary Horsley, daughter of a musical composer. She provided the stable home life that allowed him to work his killing schedule. They had 3 children, and by all accounts, Brunel was an affectionate if often absent father. His son, Henry Mark Brunel, would follow him into engineering, though he would never escape his father's shadow. The Great Eastern's construction consumed Brunel's final years. Every setback, and there were many, he took personally. When a workman was killed by a falling rivet, Brunel paid for the funeral and supported the widow. When an explosion during the maiden voyage killed 6 men and destroyed the forward funnel, Brunel, already ill, insisted on investigating personally. He was photographed on deck just days before his death, a small, exhausted figure dwarfed by his massive creation. On September 5, 1859, Brunel suffered a stroke aboard the Great Eastern. He was paralyzed on his right side but remained conscious, his mind still active in his failing body. For 10 days, he lingered, receiving reports on his various projects, dictating final instructions. On September 15, 1859, the Sombard Kingdom Brunel died at age 53, worn out by a lifetime of turning impossible dreams into iron reality. His death was front-page news around the world. The Times wrote, "He was the very Napoleon of engineers, thinking more of glory than of profit." But even in death, controversy followed in. The Great Eastern, his masterpiece, proved a commercial failure too big for the available trade. Critics said Brunel's broad-gauge railway, though superior, was incompatible with the rest of Britain's railways and had to be converted at enormous cost. Some called him reckless, a man whose ambition exceeded his judgment. Yet within a generation, Brunel's vision was vindicated. Ships grew to surpass the Great Eastern in size. Following principles he pioneered, the railway network he created became the backbone of British commerce. His bridges, tunnels, and stations still function today, carrying loads he never imagined at speeds that would have thrilled him. The Royal Albert Bridge bears his name on each end. I.K. Brunel, engineer, 1859, his monument in iron. But Brunel's true legacy goes beyond iron and steam. He embodied the Victorian age at its best, the absolute conviction that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, that the future could be built through will and calculation. He showed that engineering was not just about solving problems, but about imagining new possibilities. Every tunnel bored, every bridge spanned, every ship launched was a declaration that the old limits no longer applied. In our age of technological marvels, it's hard to appreciate how radical Brunel's achievements were. When he was born, people traveled as they had for millennia, by horse, foot, or sail. When he died, they crossed continents by steam train and oceans by iron ship. He compressed centuries of progress into decades. He didn't just build infrastructure, he built the future. Consider the sheer audacity of his vision. While others built railways that crept around hills, he carved through them. while others built ships incrementally larger. He built one 6 times bigger than anything afloat, while others said suspension bridges couldn't span more than 500 feet. He designed one that spanned 700. He failed sometimes. His atmospheric railway, his broad gauge aspects of the Great Eastern. But he failed attempting greatness. The photograph of Brunel standing before the launching chains of the Great Eastern, taken by Robert Howlett in 1857, captures him perfectly. He stands casual, hands in pockets, cigar in mouth, small against the massive chains, yet dominating the frame through sheer presence. His clothes are rumpled, his face exhausted, but his posture radiates confidence. This was a man who looked at the world and saw not what was but what could be. Brunel died thinking himself a failure, his Great Eastern struggling, his broad gauge doomed, his Clifton suspension bridge unbuilt. He couldn't know that within decades, ships larger than the Great Eastern would ply the oceans, that his engineering principles would become standard practice, that his Clifton Bridge would finally span the Avon Gorge as a memorial to his genius. He couldn't know that over a century and a half later, millions would still travel on his railways, cross his bridges, and marvel at his vision. Today, in our world of GPS and jet engines, of computers and spacecraft, Brunel's work might seem quiet, but every modern engineer stands on his shoulders. Every tunnel through a mountain, every bridge across a gorge, every ship that crosses an ocean owes something to the small man in the tall hat who refused to accept that anything was impossible. He proved that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we build, one impossible dream at a time. 3 lives, 3 different centuries, 3 different challenges, yet Marcus Aurelius, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel share something profound that speaks to us across the centuries. Each faced a world that seemed to be ending or transforming beyond recognition. Each could have chosen the easier path. Instead, they chose to fight, to build, to endure, and in doing so, they shaped the world we inhabit today. Marcus Aurelius, the reluctant emperor, showed us that true strength lies not in power but in wisdom, not in conquest but in self-control. In an age when absolute power corrupted absolutely, he remained incorruptible. His meditations, never intended for our eyes, give us a window into a great soul struggling with timeless questions. How do we maintain our humanity in inhuman times? How do we do our duty when every fiber of our being wants to quit? How do we face death, our own and those we love, without losing our minds to grief or fear? The philosopher-emperor's answers, forged in plague and war, still guide us today. When modern leaders face crisis, they still turn to Marcus's words. When we face our own dark nights of the soul, his reminder that what stands in the way becomes the way lights a path forward. Eleanor of Aquitaine refused to accept the limitations her world placed on women. In an age when queens were meant to be silent and submissive, she spoke out and took action. She didn't just survive in a man's world, she dominated it, ruling over an empire that stretched across Europe. Her patronage of arts and culture created the tradition of courtly love that still influences how we think about romance today. Every strong female leader, every woman who refuses to be silenced, every girl who dreams of being more than what society expects, follows in Eleanor's footsteps. She proved that intelligence, will, and courage matter more than gender, that a crown is not given but taken, that even 16 years of imprisonment cannot break an unbreakable spirit. Isambard Kingdom Brunel took the raw power of the Industrial Revolution and gave it direction and purpose. He didn't just build bridges and ships and railways. He built the modern world. Every time we board a train, cross a suspension bridge, or see a great ship on the horizon, we see Brunel's vision made real. But more than his physical creations, Brunel gave us something precious, the belief that no problem is too big, no dream too audacious, no challenge insurmountable if we apply enough intelligence, determination, and courage. In our age of climate change and technological disruption, we need Brunel's spirit more than ever, the absolute conviction that we can engineer a better future. These three titans teach us that greatness isn't about perfection. Marcus Aurelius made political mistakes and could be harsh in his judgments. Eleanor of Aquitaine's ambition sometimes hurt those around her, including her own children. Brunel's obsession with his projects destroyed his health and sometimes led to spectacular failures. But their flaws make their achievements more remarkable, not less. They were human beings like us, facing challenges that seemed overwhelming, making difficult choices with incomplete information, struggling with doubt and fear and exhaustion. Yet they persevered. What would our world be like if these three had chosen differently? If Marcus had abandoned the frontier and retreated to Rome's pleasures? If Eleanor had accepted her role as a silent queen? If Brunel had stayed within the boundaries of conventional engineering? The Roman Empire might have collapsed centuries earlier, ending the transmission of classical knowledge to the modern world. The culture of medieval Europe might have remained crude and militaristic, delaying the Renaissance. The Industrial Revolution might have proceeded slowly, pushing back humanity's technological progress by generations. But they didn't choose the easy path. They chose the path of maximum resistance and maximum impact. They chose to matter. As we face our own challenges, pandemics, political upheaval, technological disruption, environmental crisis, these three figures remind us that every age thinks it's witnessing the end of the world, and every age has produced individuals who refuse to accept that ending. They remind us that one person, armed with wisdom, determination, and vision, can change the course of history. Marcus teaches us to face crisis with philosophical calm and unwavering duty. Eleanor shows us that no barrier is impermeable to intelligence and will. Brunel proves that the impossible is just an engineering problem waiting to be solved. Together, they form a trilogy of human achievement that transcends their individual eras and speaks directly to ours. So, what will you do with their examples? Will you retreat into comfort when crisis calls? Will you accept the limitations others place on you? Will you say that's impossible when faced with a great challenge? Or will you, like Marcus, Eleanor, and Brunel, choose the harder path, the path of growth, struggle, and ultimate triumph? The choice, as it was for them, is yours. History is not made by the masses but by individuals who refuse to be masses. It's made by people who see not just what is, but what could be, who face plague and prejudice and impossible engineering challenges and say, I will find a way. These three titans are gone, but their spirits endure in every person who chooses courage over comfort, action over apathy, greatness over mediocrity. They echo across time, calling to us, challenging us, inspiring us to be more than we thought possible. What's your impossible dream? What's your insurmountable challenge? What's the thing everyone says can't be done? Whatever it is, remember Marcus in his freezing tent, writing philosophy while plague ravaged his empire. Remember Eleanor in her prison, planning her return to power. Remember Brunel standing before the Great Eastern, refusing to give up on his vision despite every setback. Remember them, and then get to work. The future is waiting to be built. If you found inspiration in these three remarkable lives, hit that subscribe button and join our community of history lovers. Which of these three titans resonated most with you? Was it Marcus and his stoic wisdom, Eleanor and her indomitable spirit, or Brunel and his engineering genius? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts. And if you want to dive deeper into history's most fascinating figures, click the notification bell so you never miss a story. Next week, we're exploring three more incredible lives that changed the world. Until then, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we can become.